Hello, my name is Matthew McLendon, and I'm the J. Sanford Miller Family Director and Chief Curator at the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia. I'd like to welcome you today to a new series we're calling Playing Favorites, which answers in a fun and hopefully casual and entertaining way one of the questions that I am most asked as a museum director and curator, which is, what is your favorite work of art? So in this series, we'll be looking at works from the Fralin's permanent collection of the museum, but I'm sure I will be bringing in some of my favorite works from farther afield as we go along too. So let's get started today with our first work, which is a wonderful photograph by the German photographer August Sander. Sander lived between 1876 and 1964. And he's best known for creating what the Museum of Modern Art in New York has called, quote, the most ambitious and influential portrait of the people of the 20th century. And that's actually the name of the project for which he is best known, People of the 20th Century. It's a photography project that is comprised of over 600 photographs. And those photographs are then divided into 7 volumes and nearly 50 portfolios. The portfolio that our photograph comes from, which is titled Secretary at West German Radio, Cologne, 1931. The portfolio that this photograph comes from is The Woman in Intellectual and Practical Occupation, which gives you a sense of Sander's methodology, so to speak. He was going out throughout Germany photographing people of various types and professions. The project, I think, is always a little difficult for art historians to really talk about because there is this inherent tension in each of the photographs between the individual photographs and the individuals presented therein as quote-unquote portraits, as we would traditionally think of portraits, and that each person comes across as unique with his or her own personality. But of course, each person is meant to be representative of a type or a collective. So when you're looking at Sander's work, you're constantly negotiating this, looking at each photograph. And when you really start to look at hundreds of them, which I would encourage you to seek them out on the internet and at MoMA's collection, which we'll talk more about, as you look at hundreds of them, they start to take on a kind of central casting quality themselves, like you've seen in movies before of the casting agent bringing out the big 3-ring binder full of different headshots. People of the 20th Century is unique in its magnitude in photographic history, but it certainly does have precedence in the typologies of science and natural history. Sander is creating a kind of comparison collection in a way that we would associate with a natural history museum. And I think about some of my favorite trips to museums as a child, natural history museums, and going into the galleries with large cabinets with drawers that you could pull out, and you would pull out a drawer and you would see hundreds of different butterflies, and then you'd pull out another drawer and you'd see hundreds of different kinds of beetles. And so I think that we have to read people of the 20th century within that history, as well as, of course, the history of Darwin, and some of the beliefs that really became current again at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century around physiognomy. Physiognomy is a really great word, isn't it? It comes from 2 Greek words, physis, meaning nature, and nomon, meaning judge or interpreter. And it's the belief that a person's face or outer appearance could be used in assessing character. And of course, here's where it gets dark. It was, used in a kind of pseudoscience of the late 19th and early 20th century, in that people thought that you could discern ethnic characteristics, racial characteristics through physiognomy. This is some of the foundation that would propel the pseudoscience of the early 20th century of scientific racism that would have its most disastrous and horrific manifestation, of course, with the Nazis. But now I think it's important to say Sander isn't approaching his project with these dark intentions, but the work is certainly within a larger context of that earlier history. Sander, I think, is interested in exploring how a person's profession becomes manifested in the body. And if you think about it, a carpenter's hands are certainly going to look very different from a banker's hands. He's also creating his work in a period of a movement known as the Neue Sachlichkeit in Germany. And Neue Sachlichkeit translates as new objectivity. And this was on the rise in Germany. We associated it with the visual arts in particular, and with the Weimar Republic or Weimar era, which is roughly from 1918 to 1933, so post-World War I and the lead up to World War II in Germany. And a very basic idea of Neue Sachlichkeit is that artists became re-engaged with a more practical, more realist point of view. Our Sander photograph of the radio secretary reminds me of one of my favorite paintings from this period, done a little bit earlier by the great painter Otto Dix, and that's Portrait of the Journalist Sylvia von Harden, 1926, and this is now in the collection of the Pompidou in Paris. I think this is really a favorite of any fan of this period of art history and the Neue Sachlichkeit. Here you see this brutal, really overemphasized quote-unquote realism. It's so real, it's not real. It's an exaggeration. But I think it provides, through this exaggeration, such a stirring portrait of a fierce personality. Every time I see this painting, when I'm in Paris, I make a beeline for it. I always think how interesting it would be to have had a drink with her. She looks like a real character, doesn't she? So returning to our Sander photograph in the Fralin's collection, what do we see here? Well, we see a young woman, a very, I think we could say, modern young woman of the Weimar Republic. And we really associate the Weimar with this kind of early 20th century push towards urbanism and a kind of new morality that we think of in Europe at the time. And she's certainly emblematic of that. We could say she's, looks very much like what we frequently call the new woman. She has this wonderful short bobbed haircut that adds a bit of an androgynous quality to her. She's in this really extraordinary dress. I just love this, how Sander, through the lighting, really picks up the sheen of the gown with this fantastic embroidery of the flowers on it, this natural motif. And I also really like how, again, through the lighting, he's emphasized the highlight and the shadow. It's as though behind her you almost have an abstract painting. Her head and her face are so white. Her hands are so white. They very dramatically emerge from the dress. And in the center of the composition, you have this kind of black hole of the dress. The body disappears in a way. So you're constantly negotiating that as you're looking at the photograph. She looks out of the photograph, but not directly in our eyes. She's looking a little over our shoulder, as though there's almost something more interesting happening behind us, or perhaps a more interesting person. Now again, she's living and working in the Weimar period in Germany. And this is a very critical moment, both in German and in world history in the run-up to World War II. We've come out of the Great Global Depression, but towards the end of the Weimar, there's mass unemployment, there's mass inflation, so it's very interesting that we see her as a working woman and keep that in context. And it's not only that she's a professional woman and working, she's working in a radio station. This is really the cutting edge technology of the day. The equivalent would be working at Google or Facebook or some kind of startup today. So I think that adds an air to her modernity as we look at her. And then Sander allows this space for us to wonder about the woman. What was her life? We know what's about to happen in the world. We know what happens during the war. If she's in Cologne, did she survive? Cologne was bombed 262 times in World War II, and 20,000 people died in those bombings. If she did live, what side of history was she on? Because of the power of the personality that Sonder allows to come forth in so many of these photographs, these are the types of questions we find ourselves asking. And it's really, I think, one of the things that makes them so powerful and brings us back to them again and again. Now, as I said earlier, if you're interested in seeing more from people of the 20th century, the Museum of Modern Art in New York has all 619 photographs of this series. They also have something called the August Sonder Project, which is a multi-year scholarly project investigating this, towering accomplishment, photographic record. So I encourage you to go on to the Museum of Modern Art's website and explore more of August Sonder and people of the 20th century there. Thank you for joining me on our first Play in Favorites, and I look forward to more. Thanks.